Charleston County records from 1008-147 contain a single cryptic notation that has puzzled historians for generations. Removal of remains, attic discovery, household of Mrs. H. Grenville, cause of death undetermined. Investigation ceased by order. What those sparse words conceal is a sequence of events so disturbing that 3 separate families refused to occupy the Grenville house afterward, and local physicians destroyed their notes rather than document what they'd witnessed. The bodies found in that sealed attic room told a story that contradicted every statement given by the plantation mistress, yet she faced no charges, no trial, no public reckoning. For over a century, descendants whispered about the locked room, but the full truth remained buried in damaged church records and letters that surfaced only decades later. Before we continue with the story of the Grenville Plantation and what really happened in that attic, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and leave a comment telling me what state or city you're listening from. I love knowing where my audience connects from around the world. Your support keeps these forgotten stories alive. The notation wasn't discovered until 1952, when a demolition crew preparing to tear down the abandoned Grenville house found a locked iron box beneath floorboards that had rotted through. The Grenville Plantation sprawled across 2,000 acres of South Carolina low country, where the Ashley River bent through marshland thick with cypress and live oak. In 1846, it was considered one of the more prosperous rice plantations in Charleston County, though not among the largest. Henrietta Grenville had inherited the property following her husband's death from yellow fever 3 years earlier, a circumstance that placed her in the uncomfortable position of managing both household and commercial affairs, a role that Southern society viewed with profound suspicion when undertaken by a woman alone. Henrietta was 43 that year, a woman whose angular features and penetrating gray eyes had earned her a reputation for severity long before widowhood. Her father had been a shipping merchant who'd lost everything in a bank failure, and she'd married Lawrence Grenville primarily to escape the humiliation of Gentile poverty. The marriage produced no children, a source of quiet shame that Henrietta bore with tight-lipped resignation. Lawrence's 3 nephews, orphaned when their parents perished in a steamboat explosion on the Mississippi, had come to live at the plantation in 1008-144. They were Henrietta's heirs now, though she seemed to regard them more as obligations than family. Thomas was 14, already tall and broad-shouldered, with his uncle's weak chin and restless energy. Charles, 12, possessed a calculating intelligence that made him seem older than his years. The youngest, William, had just turned 10 and suffered from a nervous disposition that manifested in stuttering and nail-biting. Local society agreed the boys needed a firm hand, which Henrietta provided with rigid schedules, strict punishments, and an insistence on propriety that bordered on obsessive. The household staff included an overseer, a cook, a lairce, 6 field hands, and 1 house servant, a young woman named Dina Yates, purchased at auction in 1008-145, when Henrietta decided she needed someone to manage the increasingly complex domestic arrangements. Dina was 17 years old, with sharp intelligence visible in her dark eyes, despite her lowered gaze and differential posture. She'd been separated from her mother and 2 younger siblings at the auction block. A trauma she carried in the tightness around her mouth, and the way her hands sometimes trembled when Henrietta spoke to her. Dina occupied a small room adjacent to the kitchen, rising before dawn to kindle fires, prepare breakfast, serve meals, mend clothing, polish silver, beat carpets, and perform the 100 other tasks that kept the household functioning. She moved through the house like a ghost, present but invisible, her footsteps deliberately soft on the pine floors. The boys largely ignored her except when demanding service. Henrietta watched her constantly correcting posture, criticizing pace, finding fault with execution of even perfectly completed tasks. Charleston society in 1008-146 existed in a state of nervous prosperity. Cotton and rice prices remained strong, But newspapers carried increasingly strident debates about tariffs, state sovereignty, and the growing tension between Southern interests and Northern abolition movements. Most plantation families avoided such discussions in mixed company, preferring to maintain the fiction of Gentile harmony while privately preparing for conflicts they sensed approaching. Women like Henrietta occupied a particularly precarious position, expected to embody Southern grace and hospitality while managing enterprises that demanded ruthless efficiency. The social calendar provided structure and validation. Henrietta attended church services every Sunday, hosted occasional dinner parties, and paid careful attention to maintaining connections with Charleston's established families. She hired a tutor for the boys and ensured they learned proper deportment, correct grammar, and enough classical education to mark them as gentlemen. Everything about the household projected order, respectability, and control, the qualities Henrietta valued above all others. But in April of 1847, that carefully maintained order began to fracture. The first incident occurred on a Tuesday morning when Henrietta discovered a valuable cameo brooch missing from her dressing table. The piece had belonged to her mother, one of the few heirlooms she'd retained from her family's wealthier days. She questioned Dina immediately, her voice sharp enough to carry through the closed bedroom door. "I've touched nothing that wasn't needed for cleaning, ma'am," Dina said, her eyes fixed on the floor. "You're the only one who enters this room besides myself." "Yes, ma'am, but I haven't taken anything." "I swear it on my life." Henrietta's jaw tightened. "Your word means nothing to me. I want that brooch returned by nightfall, or you'll be punished accordingly." The brooch didn't reappear. That evening, Henrietta had Dina locked in the smokehouse overnight, a punishment she considered measured and appropriate. The space was cramped, windowless, thick with the smell of cured meat and wood smoke. When Dina emerged the next morning, her face was pale and her hands shook, but she maintained her composure and returned to her duties without complaint. 2 days later, Henrietta discovered scratch marks on the dining room sideboard, deep gouges in the mahogany that looked deliberate. Then a silver serving spoon went missing. A week after that, she found mud tracked through the parlor despite having explicitly instructed Dina to remove her shoes before entering the house. Each incident was small, perhaps insignificant in isolation. Together, they formed a pattern that Henrietta interpreted as deliberate defiance. She increased Dina's workload, reduced her food portions, and began administering punishments with escalating severity. Hours spent kneeling on dried corn, days without sleep, confinement in increasingly uncomfortable spaces. The boys watched these developments with varying degrees of interest. Thomas seemed largely indifferent, focused on his own pursuits. Charles observed with quiet calculation as though cataloging information for future use. William grew visibly uncomfortable, his stutter worsening whenever Henrietta disciplined Dina in his presence. On May 3rd, Henrietta discovered what she considered irrefutable proof of Dina's guilt. Her escar had been forced open. The small locked desk where she kept household accounts and personal correspondence. Papers were scattered across her bedroom floor, and a leather-bound journal containing private thoughts lay open on her bed. Several pages had been torn out. Henrietta's rage was immediate and absolute. She found Dina in the kitchen preparing the midday meal. "You dare enter my private chambers. You dare read my personal writings." Dina turned, her expression confused. "Ma'am, I don't understand. Don't compound your crimes with lies." Henrietta's hand struck Dina's face hard enough to snap her head sideways. "I should have you whipped publicly. I should sell you down river where they'll teach you proper respect. Please, ma'am, I haven't touched your desk. I can barely read. I wouldn't." Silence. Henrietta's breathing was rapid, her face flushed. "I've been too lenient with you, too patient. That ends now." She summoned the overseer and had him install a heavy padlock on the attic door, a space that ran the length of the house, used primarily for storage of trunks, damaged furniture, and items awaiting repair. The room possessed only 2 small windows at either end, both nailed shut years earlier to prevent drafts. In South Carolina's spring heat, the space became stifling by midday, the air thick and still. "You'll remain here until you've learned proper humility," Henrietta announced. "When you're ready to confess your crimes and beg forgiveness, you may knock. Until then, you'll have time to reflect on your sins." She had Dina locked in the attic that afternoon, providing a single bucket of water and a chamber pot. The key went into Henrietta's pocket. What Henrietta didn't reveal to anyone, not the overseer, not the other staff, not even the boys, was her additional decision. She'd been troubled for months by what she considered the boys' softness, their lack of proper discipline and masculine authority. Thomas was becoming lazy. Charles showed disturbing signs of sneakiness. William's timidity was almost shameful. They needed to understand the realities of managing a household, of maintaining order, of exercising authority without sentiment. That evening she summoned all 3 boys to her study. "I have a task for you," she said, "one that will prepare you for the responsibilities you'll inherit. Dina has been stealing from this household and lying about her crimes. She requires correction, but also observation to ensure she doesn't harm herself or damage property in her confinement. You 3 will take turns keeping watch." Thomas frowned. "Watch her, Mom." "How?" "There's a gap in the attic floorboards where repairs were made last year. You can observe from the hallway below without her knowledge. I want reports every few hours on her behavior, her demeanor, her words if she speaks. This is your first lesson in management, understanding how those beneath you respond to discipline." Charles nodded slowly, understanding the implications immediately. William's face palled. "Is something wrong, William?" Henrietta's voice was cold. "No, ma'am," he whispered. "Good. Thomas, you'll take the first watch. 2 hours, then wake Charles. Charles, you'll wake William before dawn. I expect detailed reports." She gave them the schedule and dismissed them. None of the boys slept well that night, though for different reasons. Thomas completed his watch with dutiful, if uncomfortable, attention, reporting that Dina had paced the attic floor, tried the door repeatedly, and eventually sat in the corner farthest from the stairs. Charles's report was more detailed. He noted that she'd drunk half the water, used the chamber pot once, and seemed to be examining the walls as though looking for weak points. William arrived for his preed, on watch with visible dread. Kneeling by the gap in the hallway floor with his ear pressed close, he heard Dina crying softly, not loud sobs, but quiet, exhausted, weeping that made his chest feel tight. When Henrietta demanded his report at breakfast, he struggled through his stutter to describe what he'd observed. "She was crying, Mom, and she tried to open the W windows, but they wouldn't move. Crocodile tears." Henrietta said dismissively, "Continue the watches. I want to know if her attitude improves." The pattern continued for 3 days. Henrietta provided bread and water twice daily, passing them through a slot the overseer had cut in the door. The boys maintained their surveillance, though William began having nightmares, and Thomas complained that the task was interfering with his studies. Only Charles seemed untroubled, delivering his reports with clinical precision. On the 4th day, something changed. Thomas, taking the afternoon watch, noticed that Dina had stopped moving around the attic. She sat in the same corner, knees drawn up, head resting on her arms. When Henrietta brought the evening meal, Dina didn't approach the door. "She's being stubborn," Henrietta announced at dinner, "trying to manipulate me with passive resistance." "Very well. She'll receive food and water only once daily until I see genuine contrition." Charles spoke carefully. "Ma'am, shouldn't we be concerned about her health? Her health is her responsibility. She can end this situation at any time by admitting her crimes and begging forgiveness. But Dina didn't beg. According to the boys' reports, she barely moved. By the 6th day, she'd stopped responding when..." Henrietta called through the door. The water bucket went untouched. The bread sat where it had been left. William, taking his morning watch, pressed his face close to the gap in the floorboards. "I can see her," he whispered to Charles later, "but she's just sitting there, not moving at all." Henrietta seemed troubled but unwilling to relent. "She's play-acting," she insisted, trying to frighten me into releasing her. "I won't be manipulated." On the 7th day, the smell began. Thomas noticed it first during his afternoon watch. a sour, unpleasant odor seeping through the gap in the hallway floor. He reported it immediately, his voice tight with poorly suppressed panic. Henrietta climbed the stairs to the attic door and pressed her ear against the wood. Silence. She knocked sharply. "Dina, answer me, Dina." Nothing. Her hands fumbled with the key and the lock clicked open with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet house. The door swung inward and the smell hit her like a physical blow. Waste, sweat, and something else underneath. Something wrong. The attic stretched before her, dim and stifling heart. At the far end, near the sealed window, a figure sat motionless in corner. Henrietta took 3 steps forward before stopping abruptly. Dina wasn't sitting. She was slumped sideways, her head at an angle that suggested complete absence of consciousness, or worse. Her skin had a grayish cast, visible even in the poor light. The chamber pot had overturned at some point, its contents spreading across the floor. The water bucket sat full, untouched for days. Henrietta turned and ran for the stairs. "Thomas, fetch Dr. Grimshaw immediately. Charles, get the overseer." By the time the doctor arrived 40 minutes later, what remained of the afternoon light revealed the full horror of the scene. Dina Yates was dead. She'd been dead, Dr. Grimshaw estimated, for at least 3 days. The physician's examination was brief but thorough enough to determine cause. "Dehydration complicated by heat exhaustion," he said quietly. "In these temperatures, confined in this space." He shook his head. "How long was she up here?" 7 days, Henrietta whispered. Her face had lost all color. Dr. Grimshaw's expression hardened. 7 days in this heat without adequate water. She had water. "I provided a single bucket for 7 days. The doctor's voice rose. "Mrs. Grenville, this is..." He stopped himself, visibly struggling for control. "This is a tragedy that should never have occurred." What happened next depended on who told the story. Dr. Grimshaw's official report stated simply that a household servant had died of natural causes while confined for disciplinary reasons. Henrietta's statement to the county magistrate emphasized Dina's supposed crimes and her own measured response. The boys weren't questioned extensively, considered too young to provide reliable testimony, but something about the story didn't align. The full water bucket bothered Dr. Grimshaw enough that he mentioned it to his wife, who mentioned it to her sister, who mentioned it to her pastor. If Dina was dying of thirst, why hadn't she drunk the water provided? The answer came 3 days later when the cook, pressed by the overseer, admitted something she'd been afraid to reveal. On the 5th day of Dina's confinement, she'd seen Master Charles in the kitchen very early in the morning before anyone else had risen. He'd been doing something near the water barrel. She couldn't see what exactly. When she asked what he was doing, he'd startled badly and hurried away without explanation. Overseer examined the barrel and found nothing unusual, but the cook's testimony raised a question that couldn't be easily dismissed. Had Charles tampered with Dinah's water supply? Henrietta buried Dinah in the plantation cemetery with minimal ceremony, marking the grave with a simple wooden cross. The county magistrate accepted Dr. Grimshaw's report with a notation that the death, while unfortunate, resulted from acceptable disciplinary measures that unfortunately exceeded their intended severity. No charges were filed. No investigation was conducted. Henrietta was cautioned to exercise better judgment in future household management, but the whispers wouldn't stop. Dr. Grimshaw, despite his official discretion, remained troubled by details that didn't fit. He'd noticed marks on Dina's arms, scratches around her wrists that suggested she'd clawed at something repeatedly. Positioning of her body near the window implied she'd been trying to reach fresh air or escape heat. Most disturbing was the full water bucket placed conspicuously in the center of the room as though positioned after the fact. He confided his concerns to Reverend Aldrich, who served the local Episcopal congregation. The Reverend had known Henrietta for years and found her distant but devout, hardly the type to deliberately cause a death. Yet he couldn't ignore the physician's observations. "There's something wrong with the sequence of events," Dr. Grimshaw said during a private meeting in the church office. "If she had water available, she wouldn't have died of dehydration. Either she was too disoriented to drink, which suggests longer confinement than admitted, or something prevented her from accessing it." "What are you suggesting?" "I don't know, but I've been a physician for 30 years, and I've seen similar deaths, usually in children or elderly, left in hot spaces without adequate fluids. This girl was young and healthy. 7 days in that attic shouldn't have killed her if she had full access to water. Reverend Aldridge nodded slowly. What about the boys? They were involved in monitoring her, according to Mrs. Grenville, yes, but they weren't questioned thoroughly. The Reverend made discreet inquiries among the household staff. What he learned deepened rather than resolved his concerns. The cook confirmed her story about seeing Charles near the water barrel. Lairce mentioned that Henrietta had burned several items of clothing the day after Dinah's death, including dresses belonging to Dina herself. The overseer admitted that Henrietta had insisted on personally cleaning the attic, refusing help and keeping the door locked for 3 days after the body removal. Most disturbing was information from William's tutor, who'd noticed significant changes in the youngest boy's behavior. William had stopped sleeping through the night, suffered frequent crying spells, and developed a pronounced fear of closed spaces. When the tutor gently inquired about the source of his distress, William had burst into tears and stammered something about not being able to help her, and Charles said, "We weren't supposed to." The tutor reported this to Reverend Aldridge, who decided to speak with William directly. The conversation took place in the church garden. On a Sunday afternoon when Henrietta was occupied with other parishioners, William, the Reverend, said gently, "I understand you've been having difficult nightmares." The boy nodded, his eyes downcast. "Would you like to tell me what troubles you?" William's hands twisted together. I can't, sir." Aunt H. Henrietta said, "We aren't to speak of it." Charles said, "There would be consequences if I told. Sometimes keeping secrets causes more harm than revealing them." "What happened in the attic, William?" The boy's face crumpled. "She was just so thirsty, sir. I could hear her through the floor begging for woo water. But Charles said we had to follow Aunt Henrietta's orders." "Exactly. And then she stopped making sounds, and I thought maybe she was sleeping. But Charles laughed and said she was probably dying. And I wanted to tell someone, but he said I'd be punished, that Aunt Henrietta would lock me in the attic, too, if I caused trouble." Reverend Aldridge felt his stomach tighten. "When was this, William? When did she stop making sounds?" "The 4th day, I think. Maybe the 5th. I am not sure." The days blurred together. "And did Charles do anything unusual during that time?" "Anything that seemed wrong." William's eyes widened with fear. "I can't tell," he said. "I understand, but this is important, son. Was there something with the water?" A long silence followed. Finally, William whispered, "He put something in it. The night before she stopped moving, I saw him through a crack in my door. He had a vial from Aunt Henrietta's medicine cabinet. He poured it into the water bucket before she got her morning portion." The Reverend felt cold despite the warm afternoon. "What kind of vial?" "Small brown glass. I don't know what was in it, and you told no one." William shook his head, tears streaming down his face. He said Henrietta knew that it was part of the lesson, that I was too weak to understand what needed to be done. But I didn't believe him, not really. I was scared, sir. I'm still scared." Reverend Aldrich reported this conversation to Dr. Grimshaw, who immediately checked his medical supplies against the inventory he maintained. 1 bottle was missing: linum, a tincture of opium commonly prescribed for pain and sleep disorders. A full dose could cause deep sedation. Multiple doses could cause respiratory depression, confusion, and potentially death, especially combined with heat and dehydration. The physician confronted Henrietta directly. She was in the parlor when he arrived unannounced, her face composed but weary. "Mrs. Grenville, I need to ask you some very serious questions." She gestured to a chair. "Of course, doctor, though I can't imagine what requires such urgency. Did you give your nephew Charles any medications from your cabinet, specifically laudanum?" Henrietta's expression didn't change. "I keep my medicines locked. Charles has no access to them. That's not what I asked." "Did you give him anything?" "No. Why would I?" "Doctor," Grimshaw studied her carefully, "your medicine cabinet was accessed the night before Dina Yates died. A bottle of laudanum is missing from my office records. One I'd prescribed for you last winter. Perhaps it was used and forgotten. I don't track every dose. Mrs. Grenville, if that laudanum was administered to Dina, either deliberately or as some misguided attempt at sedation, It could explain her death. Combined with heat and insufficient water, even a small amount could have been fatal. Henrietta's jaw tightened. I administered no such substance. If someone else did, I have no knowledge of it. Your nephew William suggests otherwise. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Henrietta's voice became very soft. William is a nervous, imaginative child, prone to nightmares and exaggeration. If he's been telling tales, I'll address that appropriately. This isn't a tale, Mrs. Grenville. A young woman is dead under highly suspicious circumstances. If there was criminal negligence or worse, there was an unfortunate accident, nothing more. The magistrate has closed the matter. I suggest you do the same, doctor, unless you wish to face allegations of slander. The threat was clear. Dr. Grimshaw left without another word, but his mind was far from settled. He spoke with Reverend Aldrich again, and together they approached the magistrate with their concerns. The official listened politely and made notes, but ultimately refused to reopen the investigation. You have speculation, gentlemen, but no proof. A nervous child's accusations and a missing bottle of medicine. Mrs. Grenville is a respected member of this community. Without concrete evidence, I cannot subject her to further scrutiny. Frustrated but not defeated, Dr. Grimshaw decided to examine the attic one final time. Henrietta had locked it immediately after cleaning, but the overseer still had a key. The physician waited until Henrietta left for a social call in Charleston, then conducted a thorough inspection. The space had been scrubbed clean, too clean. Every surface gleamed. The floorboards near where Dinah's body had been found showed evidence of recent sanding, as though someone had removed stains. Most telling was the window at the far end. The nails holding it shut had been recently hammered. The surrounding wood showed fresh damage, and the nails themselves were new, different from the rusted ones securing the window at the opposite end. Dr. Grimshaw examined the sill more carefully and found deep scratches in the wood, the kind that might be made by desperate fingers clawing at a sealed surface. Below the window on the floor, he discovered something Henrietta's cleaning had missed. A small button, the type used on women's dress sleeves. It was lodged between two floorboards, stained dark brown with what could only be dried blood. He pocketed the button and left quickly, his hands trembling. That evening, he wrote a detailed letter documenting all his findings and suspicions, sealed it, and left it with his attorney with instructions that it be held unless his death or disappearance suggested foul play. The letter stated his belief that Dina Yates had not died from simple heat exhaustion and dehydration, but from a combination of factors that suggested deliberate cruelty, if not outright murder, drugged water that prevented her from drinking or seeking help, deliberate sealing of the only potential escape route, and extended confinement beyond what any reasonable person would consider survivable in such conditions. Most chilling was his conclusion: I believe Mrs. Henrietta Grenville orchestrated this death, possibly with the knowing assistance of her nephew Charles, as a means of disposing of a servant she viewed as troublesome, while simultaneously teaching her male heirs a lesson in absolute authority. The youngest nephew, William, appears traumatized by what he witnessed, suggesting the boys were forced to participate in monitoring Dinah's deterioration, a form of psychological torture that served dual purposes of punishment and education in the brutal exercise of power over the enslaved. The household that summer took on a quality of brittle normalcy. Henrietta hired a new house servant, a middle-aged woman named Ruth, who kept her eyes down and her mouth shut. Thomas left for boarding school in Virginia, relieved to escape the oppressive atmosphere. Charles remained, increasingly, taking on responsibilities around the plantation with a competence that Henrietta found satisfying. William grew quieter, more withdrawn, his stutter worsening until he could barely speak in Henrietta's presence. In late August, Reverend Aldrich received an unexpected visitor, Dina's mother, Cora Yates. She'd been sold to a plantation in Georgia shortly after Dina's purchase, but had heard through the underground networks that enslaved people maintained that her daughter had died. She'd risked severe punishment by running away to learn the truth. The Reverend met her in the church after dark, horrified by the risks she'd taken. "You can't be here," he said urgently. "If they find you, I need to know what happened to my baby. They told me she died, but nobody would say how. I need to know." He hesitated, then told her everything he knew or suspected. Cora listened in silence, her face expressionless until he finished. Then she nodded once sharply. "That woman killed my child. Not accident, not carelessness, murder. We can't prove that. The magistrate won't. White man's justice won't touch her," Cora said quietly, "but there are other kinds of justice, other ways of making things right." Reverend Aldridge felt a chill of warning. "Cora, whatever you're thinking, don't. You'll only bring more suffering on yourself. My daughter suffered. She died alone, scared, hurting. That woman needs to understand what that feels like. Revenge won't bring Dina back. No, but it might make that woman think twice before she hurts someone else's child." She left before dawn, disappearing back into the network of roads and hideaways that facilitated the desperate journeys of those seeking freedom or vengeance. Reverend Aldrich prayed she'd simply return to Georgia and rebuild her life, but he knew better. 3 weeks later, a fire broke out in Grenville House kitchen in the middle of the night. It spread quickly through the dry wood of the older section, consuming the ground floor and sending flames racing up the walls toward the bedrooms. Henrietta awoke to the smell of smoke, shouting for the boys and stumbling into the hallway. House staff managed to evacuate everyone safely, and neighbors helped form a bucket brigade that eventually contained the blaze before it destroyed the entire structure. The damage was extensive, but not catastrophic. The kitchen was gutted. Part of the first floor required rebuilding, and smoke had damaged furnishings throughout the house. The overseer's investigation suggested the fire started near the hearth, perhaps embers that hadn't been properly banked. But Ruth, the house servant, pulled Reverend Aldrich aside at church the following Sunday and whispered something that made his blood run cold. "I saw someone that night, sir, before the fire, a woman moving through the yard near the kitchen. I thought it was a dream at first, but when I looked closer, she was real, and she was watching the house like she was waiting for something." "Did you recognize her?" "No, sir, but she had this look on her face like she was satisfied about something." The Reverend didn't ask more questions, but his mind immediately went to Cora Yates. Had she returned? Had she started the fire deliberately? If so, she'd made a calculated choice. Fire was dangerous but survivable, a warning rather than execution, but the message was clear. "I can reach you, I can hurt you. Be grateful I showed mercy. My daughter wasn't given." Henrietta seemed to understand this on some instinctive level. She became increasingly paranoid, installing new locks on all doors and windows, sleeping with a pistol under her pillow, jumping at unexpected sounds. Charles noticed the change in her demeanor and seemed to absorb her fear, becoming hypervigilant himself. William, meanwhile, seemed almost relieved by the fire, as though the external threat validated his internal terrors and made them comprehensible to others. "Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in the Grenville household intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this." Let's discover together what happens next. In October, something even stranger occurred. Henrietta awoke one morning to find her bedroom window open despite having locked it securely the night before. On her dressing table sat a small cloth doll, crudely made but unmistakable in its features. The doll wore a miniature dress fashioned from the same fabric as one of Henrietta's own gowns. Around its throat was tied a noose made from black thread. She held the doll with trembling hands, understanding the symbolism immediately. Someone was in her house, someone with access to her personal belongings, someone who wanted her dead. The overseer searched the grounds but found no signs of intrusion. The locks showed no evidence of tampering. Whoever had delivered this message had moved through the house like smoke, leaving only this single artifact as proof of their presence. Henrietta burned the doll immediately, but couldn't burn away the fear it inspired. She began having the attic door checked multiple times daily, as though worried someone might be hiding there. She questioned the staff repeatedly, accusing them of conspiracy, of harboring outsiders, of plotting against her. Ruth endured these interrogations with stoic patience, but her eyes reflected contempt. Henrietta was too distracted to notice. Charles, observing all this, began his own investigation. He was 15 now, tall and cold. died with a calculating intelligence he'd inherited from his late uncle. He questioned the field hands, searched the outbuildings, examined the houses' perimeter. His methodical approach uncovered something the overseer had missed, a pattern of small disturbances suggesting someone had been sheltering in the old carriage house at the far edge of the property. He found evidence of recent habitation, crushed grass where someone had slept, scraps of food, a water jug. Most damning was a piece of fabric caught on a nail, rough homespun cotton of the type worn by field slaves, but in a pattern he didn't recognize as belonging to anyone on the Grenville plantation. Charles reported this to Henrietta, whose paranoia crystallized into action. She ordered the overseer to organize patrols, offered a reward for information about intruders, and sent word to neighboring plantations warning them of a possible runaway or infiltrator. The net tightened, and within a week the patrols captured someone trying to slip back onto the property after dark. It wasn't Cora Yates. It was a young man named Isaac, who'd worked briefly at the plantation 2 years earlier before being sold after an incident involving alleged theft. He'd escaped from his new owner and made his way back to the area, motivated by factors he refused to explain despite severe questioning. Under pressure, he finally revealed part of the truth. "There's a woman," he said. "She paid me to watch the house, to leave things for Mrs. Grenville to find to make her scared." "What woman? Where is she?" "Don't know her name, don't know where she went. She found me on the road, offered me food and coin, asked me to do these things, said it was justice for something that happened here." Henrietta knew immediately who he meant, but Cora was gone, vanished back into the network that protected runaways and those seeking revenge against their oppressors. Isaac was sold at auction the following week, sent to a rice plantation deep in the Georgia swamps, where escape was virtually impossible. The harassment stopped, but Henrietta's fear didn't. She'd learned something about vulnerability that her wealth, position, and race didn't make her untouchable, that there were forms of power that existed outside the systems she understood and controlled. The truth about what happened in the attic came to light in the most unexpected way. Nearly 6 months after Diner's death in February of 1848, William suffered a complete nervous collapse. His tutor found him in the library shaking and speaking in rapid, incoherent sentences about water and locked doors and Charles's face in the darkness. Dr. Grimshaw was summoned. He administered a sedative and sat with William while the boy gradually calmed enough to speak coherently. What emerged was a detailed confession of everything William had witnessed during those 7 days. "She wasn't supposed to die," William whispered. "That's what Aunt Henrietta kept saying. It was just supposed to teach her proper respect. But after the 3rd day, I could hear Dina through the floor, and she wasn't herself anymore. She was talking to people who weren't there, saying things that didn't make sense. And when I told Aunt Henrietta, she just said it meant the lesson was working." "What about the water, William? Tell me about the water." The boy's eyes filled with tears. Charles said Aunt Henrietta told him to add the medicine. Just a little bit to make Dina sleep so she wouldn't cause trouble or hurt herself. But I saw how much he poured in. It was more than a little bit. When I asked him about it, he said I was stupid, that I didn't understand how to properly manage servants. He said the medicine would make her stop being difficult, stop making noise, stop causing problems. Did your aunt know Charles had used that much? I don't know, maybe she didn't ask. When we told her Dina had stopped moving, stopped making sounds, she just nodded and said to continue watching. On the 6th day, Thomas told her something was wrong, that Dina looked sick, but Aunt Henrietta said she was play acting and we weren't to be manipulated. Dr. Grimshaw's hands tightened on his medical bag, and when did she realize Dina was actually dying? William's voice dropped to barely a whisper. I think maybe she knew earlier than she admitted. On the morning of the 6th day, I heard her standing outside the attic door. I was in the hallway supposed to be watching, but I'd fallen asleep. She didn't know I was there. I heard her try the lock, heard her whisper something through the door. She said, "Are you ready to beg yet, or are you too proud to save yourself?" There was no answer from inside, nothing, and Aunt Henrietta just stood there for the longest time, listening to that silence. Then she locked the door again and walked away. The physician felt his throat tighten. She knew Dina wasn't responding. She knew something was terribly wrong, and she did nothing. That's not all. William continued, his words coming faster now, as though a dam had broken. On the 7th day, before she opened the door in front of everyone, I saw her face. She looked scared, really scared. But then when the overseer arrived, when other people were present, she acted surprised, like she hadn't expected it at all, like she was shocked and horrified. But I'd seen her face just minutes before. She knew what she'd find in there. Doctor, Grimshaw leaned forward. William, this is crucial. Do you believe your aunt intended for Dina to die? The boy was silent for a long moment, wrestling with the implications of his answer. I don't think she planned it from the beginning. I think she just wanted Dina to suffer, to be broken, to come out of that attic completely submissive. But somewhere during those days, when it became clear Dina was past the point of recovery, Aunt Henrietta made a choice. She chose to let her die rather than admit the discipline had gone too far. She chose her pride over Dina's life, and Charles, what was his role? William's expression hardened. A glimpse of the man he'd become beneath the traumatized child. Charles enjoyed it. That's what made it so terrible. Thomas was uncomfortable but obedient. I was terrified. But Charles, he would come back from his watches and describe what he'd seen with this look on his face. Satisfaction. Power. He'd talk about how Dina had tried to reach the water but couldn't coordinate her movements, how she'd scratched at the walls, how her speech had become slurred and nonsensical. He documented it all like he was conducting an experiment. The physician sat back, his mind racing through implications. Had Henrietta orchestrated the entire event with deliberate intent to kill? Or had she simply been criminally negligent, allowing pride and anger to override basic human compassion until it was too late? The distinction mattered legally, but perhaps not morally. But William wasn't finished. There's something else, something I've never told anyone. He pulled a small notebook from his pocket, worn, water-stained, clearly carried and reread many times. I kept notes. During those 7 days and afterward, I was so scared I'd forget details or convince myself it hadn't been as bad as it was. So I wrote everything down. Times, observations, things Charles and Aunt Henrietta said. I have proof, Dr. Grimshaw, dated proof of what happened. The physician took the notebook with trembling hands and began to read. What he found was devastating in its detail. William had recorded not just events, but conversations, facial expressions, the progression of Dina's deterioration as observed through the gap in the floorboards. The entries painted a picture of systematic cruelty that went far beyond discipline or even criminal negligence. One entry from the 4th day read, 2:15 in the afternoon. Watched Dina try to stand but fall immediately. She's calling for her mother. Charles is laughing downstairs. Says she sounds like an animal. Aunt Henrietta told him that's what happens when slaves forget their place. They become animals again. I don't understand how they can be so calm. Another from the 6th day. Early morning heard Aunt Henrietta outside the attic door again. She said, You brought this on yourself. Pride before a fall. The Bible says your pride will kill you. Then she walked away. Dina didn't make any sound in response. I think she can't hear anymore or can't understand. When I took my watch, I could see her lying near the window. She wasn't moving. I wanted to open the door, but Charles was watching me. He said if I interfered, Aunt Henrietta would punish me the same way. Dr. Grimshaw looked up from the notebook, his eyes wet. William, do you understand what this represents? This is evidence of premeditated murder. Your aunt had multiple opportunities to intervene and chose not to. That's not negligence. That's deliberate killing. I know, William said quietly. That's why I've been so scared. If I show this to anyone, I'm accusing my own aunt of murder. But if I don't, Dina died for nothing. She died, and no one will ever know the truth. The physician made his decision in that moment. I'm taking this to Reverend Aldridge. Together, we're approaching the magistrate one final time. This changes everything. But before they could act, Charles discovered that William had spoken with Dr. Grimshaw. The household dynamics shifted with sudden dangerous tension. Charles, now 15 and frighteningly mature for his age, confronted William in the latter's bedroom late that same evening. You told him, Charles said, his voice flat and cold. You told the doctor about the attic. William backed against the wall. Someone had, too, what we did, what Aunt Henrietta did. It was murder. It was discipline that went wrong. There's a difference. No, there isn't. Not when you have chances to stop it and don't. Not when you enjoy watching someone suffer. Charles's expression didn't change. You've always been weak, William. Too sentimental, too soft. Aunt Henrietta says, You'll never be able to manage property properly because you can't separate emotion from necessity. I don't want to manage property. I don't want any part of this life. Then you're a fool. This life is all we have. The plantation, the authority, the respect, it all depends on maintaining order. What happened to Dina was unfortunate but necessary. She was defiant. She needed to be broken. The fact that she died instead doesn't change the principle. William stared at his cousin, seeing something he'd hoped wasn't there. A complete absence of remorse or even basic recognition that Dina had been human. "You're just like her," he whispered. "You're exactly like Aunt Henrietta." "Good. She's teaching me to be strong, something your father clearly failed to do for you." Charles left, but his threat was implicit. He would tell Henrietta about William's confession and the notebook. The household would close ranks. The boy would be painted as unstable, imaginative, unable to distinguish reality from nightmare. But Charles underestimated Dr. Grimshaw's determination. The physician moved quickly, copying William's notebook entries before Charles could confiscate the original. He shared the copies with Reverend Aldrich, and together they approached the magistrate with their documentation. Dr. Grimshaw's medical notes, William's contemporary journal entries, the button with blood stains, evidence of the Lord's disappearance, and a timeline that showed Dina had likely been dead or dying for days before her body was officially discovered. The magistrate was a man named Horace Bellamy, 58 years old, who'd served in his position for 2 decades. He listened to their presentation with growing discomfort, his fingers drumming on his desk as they laid out the evidence piece by piece. When they finished, he sat in silence for a long moment, studying the documents spread before him. Finally, he spoke. "What you're describing is at minimum criminal negligence and possibly deliberate murder. But prosecuting Mrs. Grenville would require testimony from the boys, testimony that implicates them as accomplices. Are you prepared to see those children face criminal consequences?" They were children following orders. Reverend Aldrich protested. William was 10 years old. He had no authority to countermand his aunt. The law doesn't always recognize that distinction. Charles was 13, old enough to understand right from wrong. Thomas was 14, and consider the social implications, gentlemen. Mrs. Grenville is a respected member of Charleston society. Her late husband's family has connections throughout the state. The victim was, he paused, choosing words carefully. The victim was enslaved property. In the eyes of the law, no court in South Carolina will convict a white woman of murder for the death of a slave, regardless of circumstances. Dr. Grimshaw's voice was steel, so justice means nothing. We have documented evidence of systematic torture leading to death. We have contemporary journal entries from a witness. We have medical evidence, and you're saying none of that matters. I'm saying it won't result in a conviction. You'll destroy those boys' futures, drag the Grenville name through public scandal, expose this community to northern criticism about how we manage our peculiar institution, and accomplish nothing except making martyrs of a respectable family. Is that what you want? I want justice for a girl who died in agony while people who could have saved her chose not to. Magistrate Bellamy's expression softened slightly. I understand your frustration, Dr. Grimshaw. Truly, I do, but I must consider broader implications. If we prosecute cases like this, where do we draw the line? Every plantation in South Carolina uses physical discipline to maintain order. Some of that discipline inevitably results in injury or death. If we start treating such incidents as criminal matters, the entire social structure collapses. Property rights become meaningless. Authority becomes unenforceable. We're not talking about routine discipline, Reverend Aldrich interjected. We're talking about a woman who deliberately withheld aid from a dying person, who used her own nephews as witnesses to suffering, who showed not a shred of remorse. Can you prove deliberate intent beyond reasonable doubt? Because Mrs. Grenville's attorney will argue that she was following accepted practices for managing difficult slaves, that the death was an accident resulting from the girl's own stubbornness in refusing to drink available water. That Mrs. Grenville is herself a victim, a widow trying to maintain order in difficult circumstances. The magistrate stood and walked to his window, looking out at Charleston streets. Gentlemen, I'm going to be frank with you. Even if I wanted to pursue this case, and I'll admit, the evidence is disturbing, I lack the political capital to do so. Mrs. Grenville's family has the governor's ear. They have connections to judges, legislators, and influential merchants. If I bring charges against her, my career ends. My ability to serve justice in other cases ends, and for what? A case that will be dismissed before it reaches trial. So we do nothing. Doctor, Grimshaw's voice cracked with frustration. I didn't say that. I'm saying we must be strategic. Document everything. Keep your records secure. But understand that justice in this case may need to come from history rather than courts. Someday, perhaps, society will be ready to judge cases like this appropriately. Today is not that day. They left defeated, but not entirely without recourse. Dr. Grimshaw's letter to his attorney remained sealed, but documented. Reverend Aldrich wrote his own account and deposited it with the church archives, noting that it should be opened only after Henrietta Grenville's death. Both men agreed that history, if not contemporary law, should know the truth. But there was one more revelation to come. In March, Thomas returned from boarding school for a brief visit. He'd matured in his months away, grown taller and more serious with shadows under his eyes that suggested troubled sleep. He sought out William and found him reading in the library. "I need to tell you something," Thomas said quietly, closing the door behind him, "about Dinah, about what really happened." William looked up wearily. "What do you mean?" Thomas sat down heavily, as though the weight of what he carried had become too much to bear standing. Charles didn't act alone. Aunt Henrietta gave him explicit instructions about the lordum. I heard them talking the night before he put it in the water. I was supposed to be asleep, but their voices carried through the wall between our rooms. She told him exactly how much to use, said it would solve the problem permanently if done correctly. William's face went white. "You knew all this time? You knew she meant to kill Dina?" "I wasn't certain. I wanted to believe I'd misunderstood. But then during my watches, I saw how deliberate everything was. The way Aunt Henrietta checked on our reports, the way she reacted or didn't react when we told her Dina was deteriorating. She was managing the situation. William, controlling it, making sure it progressed to its intended conclusion while maintaining plausible deniability. "Why didn't you stop it? Why didn't you tell someone?" Thomas's voice broke because I was terrified. Aunt Henrietta made it clear what would happen if any of us disobeyed. She said we were learning to be men, learning to make hard decisions, learning that authority requires strength. She said if we proved too weak for the lesson, she'd know we were unfit to inherit anything. I was 14 years old, orphaned, completely dependent on her. What was I supposed to do? "You were supposed to save her," William said quietly. "We all were, and we didn't. I know, and it's destroying me. I can't sleep without seeing her face. I can't eat without thinking about how she died of thirst while water sat feet away. I can't look at Aunt Henrietta without wanting to." He stopped himself. "That's why I'm telling you now, because you're falling apart, and it's not right that you carry this guilt alone. Charles might have poured the poison, but Aunt Henrietta told him to do it. She's the one truly responsible, and I enabled it by staying silent. Why are you telling me now?" Thomas looked away, unable to meet his cousin's eyes. "Because I'm not coming back. I've arranged to stay with friends in Virginia after school ends. Their family has agreed to sponsor my further education. I'm not living in this house again, not under her authority. But you're still here, still suffering. You deserve to know it wasn't your fault. None of it was your fault. The blame belongs to Aunt Henrietta and to those of us who were old enough to recognize evil and did nothing to stop it." He pulled a sealed envelope from his pocket. "This is my written testimony about what I heard and witnessed. I'm leaving it with you. Do with it what you think right. Show it to Dr. Grimshaw or Reverend Aldrich if you believe it will help. I've written another copy and left it with a lawyer in Virginia with instructions to release it if anything happens to you or to me. Aunt Henrietta needs to know that her secrets aren't as secure as she believes." Thomas stood to leave, then paused at the door. "William, there's one more thing. The morning after Dina died, I saw Aunt Henrietta burning papers in the fireplace, letters, I think, and a journal. She didn't know I was watching. Whatever she wrote about her intentions, about her planning, she destroyed the evidence. But she can't destroy what we witnessed, what we remember. That's why she'll always see us as threats. Be careful." He left before William could respond, and true to his word, Thomas never returned to the Grenville Plantation. He severed contact with Henrietta entirely, building a life in Virginia, far from South Carolina's dark memories. William, armed with Thomas's testimony and his own documented evidence, confronted Henrietta directly. It was a cold March evening, rain beating against the windows, and they were alone in the parlor. He didn't stutter when he spoke. Anger had burned through his fear, leaving something harder and clearer behind. "Thomas told me what you did, what you told Charles to do. You murdered Dina deliberately." Henrietta set down her embroidery with careful precision, her face betraying nothing. "Your brother is mistaken or lying. I did no such thing. You gave Charles the lordum. You told him how much to use. You wanted her dead, and you made Charles do it so you could claim innocence. Thomas heard you. I documented what we witnessed. Dr. Grimshaw has copies. Your secrets are no longer secret." For a long moment Henrietta said nothing. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled, a cold expression that never reached her eyes. "And what will you do with this information, William? Tell the magistrate. He won't care. He's already declined to pursue the matter. Tell the community. They'll call you mad, a traumatized child unable to distinguish reality from nightmare. That slave girl was mine to discipline as I saw fit. If she died, it was her own weakness that killed her, not me. She was a person, a human being with thoughts and feelings and a mother who loved her. She was property, and she was rebellious, disrespectful property that needed correction. I gave her opportunities to submit properly. She refused. What happened next was her choice, not mine. She could have begged for mercy. She could have confessed her crimes and shown proper humility. She chose pride instead. Pride killed her, not me." William stared at his aunt, seeing clearly for the first time the absolute void where empathy should have been. Henrietta Grenville wasn't cruel in the passionate sense. She was something colder and more terrifying. She'd killed Dina not in rage, but as a calculated solution to a problem, with no more moral weight than one might give to destroying a broken tool. And she'd used her nephews as instruments of that killing, shaping them into accomplices while maintaining her own illusion of propriety. "You're a monster," he whispered. Henrietta's smile widened slightly. "I'm a woman who understands that order and discipline require firmness. You're too weak to comprehend that. You always have been. Your father was soft, too. It's probably why he and your mother died so pathetically in that steamboat accident. Weakness breeds tragedy, William. Strength prevents it." The cruelty of that statement, casually dismissing his parents' deaths as consequence of weakness, broke something in William, but instead of shattering him, it crystallized his resolve. "I'm leaving," he said. "Dr. Grimshaw is helping me arrange placement with family in Pennsylvania. I'm going north, where people like you don't define what strength means. And I'm taking my documentation with me. Someday, when you're dead and can't hurt anyone else, the truth will come out. People will know what you did. History will judge you even if courts won't. History is written by Victor's child, and I've already won." William left the room without another word. Within a month, he'd arranged through Dr. Grimshaw's assistants to be sent to a distant cousin in Pennsylvania. He never returned to South Carolina, and he never spoke to Henrietta again. Henrietta Grenville lived another 32 years, dying in 1008, 179 at the age of 76. She never remarried, never left the plantation, never acknowledged what had happened in that attic. The house stood empty for the last decade of her life. She'd moved to a smaller property after the main building suffered extensive damage in another fire in 1008, 167. This one accidentally started by a discarded lantern, but destructive enough to make the structure uninhabitable. The attic burned completely along with whatever physical evidence might have remained. In her final years, Henrietta developed a reputation in Charleston as an eccentric recluse who rarely received visitors and spent most of her time writing lengthy letters to newspaper editors about the erosion of proper social order. She railed against Northern interference, against the loss of what she termed traditional household management, against the younger generation's softness. Her letters revealed a woman who'd learned nothing and regretted nothing, who remained convinced until her final breath that she'd been right and the world had gone wrong. Her will left the plantation property to Charles, though by then it was heavily mortgaged and virtually worthless. She left nothing to Thomas or William. Both were explicitly disinherited, with language noting their betrayal of family loyalty and propagation of malicious falsehoods. Her final document was a personal memoir she'd written over many years, intended for publication after her death. It painted her as a misunderstood woman who'd done her best in difficult circumstances, a victim of ungrateful nephews and meddling community members who didn't understand the burdens of managing a household and property in turbulent times. The memoir made no mention of Dina Yates. It was as though the girl had never existed. Charles inherited the plantation but sold it immediately, moving to Mobile, where his past wasn't known and his family name carried no baggage. He became a successful cotton broker, then moved into shipping and railroad investments. By all external measures, he prospered, accumulating wealth, marrying well, building a mansion that announced his status to anyone who saw it. But those who knew him spoke of his coldness, his calculating nature, his complete inability to form warm personal connections. His wife bore him 2 children, but left him in 1873, taking the children and returning to her family in Savannah. The divorce was quiet, but absolute. She discovered something about Charles that made continued marriage impossible. She never specified publicly what she'd learned, but private letters later found among her papers suggest she discovered evidence of how he treated the people he employed, including servants who'd suffered under conditions she described as deliberately cruel and designed to break spirits rather than employ labor. Charles died in 191 at age 56, found in his office with an empty bottle of laudanum beside him. The coroner ruled it an accidental overdose, but those familiar with his habits knew he rarely used the drug. Whether his death was suicide motivated by demons he'd never confronted, or simply the final consequence of a life lived without conscience, no one could say with certainty. He was buried in Mobile with minimal ceremony. No family attended. Thomas practiced law in Virginia and lived until 1903. He married, raised 4 children, and maintained a reputation for fairness and integrity that was noted in his obituary. He specialized in cases involving labor disputes and workers' rights, an unusual focus for a man of his background, and one that raised eyebrows among Virginia's plantation class. His children later wrote that he'd been haunted by something from his past, that he sometimes woke from nightmares, speaking about locked doors and watching eyes, but that he'd channeled his trauma into productive advocacy for those with no power to protect themselves. He left explicit instructions that he wasn't to be buried in South Carolina, that his body should never return to Charleston County. His headstone in Richmond reads, Thomas Grenville, Attorney at Law, 1008, 132, 1903. He stood for justice when justice was difficult. His children didn't fully understand the inscription's significance until after his death, when they discovered a sealed box among his papers containing his testimony about Dinah's death and a letter explaining why he'd spent his life trying to atone for his childhood cowardice. William became a minister in Pennsylvania and spent his life working with the poor and forgotten, including formerly enslaved people who'd made their way north after the Civil War. His church in Philadelphia became known as a sanctuary for those fleeing Southern violence during Reconstruction, a place where people could find food, shelter, temporary work, and assistance getting established in the city. He wrote extensively about social justice and the moral rot of slavery, contributing essays to abolitionist publications even after the war ended. His writings were marked by intimate knowledge of slavery's psychological mechanisms, how it corrupted both enslaved and enslaver, how it destroyed empathy in those who practiced it, how it twisted children raised within its logic into adults capable of treating human suffering as background noise. He never named Henrietta or identified the specific incident that had shaped his convictions, but careful readers could sense personal trauma beneath his theological arguments. One essay published in 1872 included a passage that seemed to reference his childhood. "I have seen evil enacted by those who considered themselves righteous. I have watched suffering inflicted by those who believed they served God's ordained order. The devil's greatest trick is not making us believe he doesn't exist. It is convincing us that our cruelty serves divine purpose, that our violence maintains necessary hierarchy, that the screams of the innocent are sounds of correction rather than cries for mercy we are obligated to answer." William married but had no children by choice. His wife later explained to friends he'd been terrified of passing his trauma to another generation, worried that some darkness he'd witnessed might be communicable through parenting. He died in 1897 at age 60, pneumonia taking him quickly after a life spent working in Philadelphia's poorest neighborhoods. His funeral drew hundreds of people, black and white, poor and middle class, people whose lives he'd touched through decades of quiet, consistent service to those society dismissed. His personal papers were donated to the Pennsylvania Historical Society and included the complete text of his childhood journal, his correspondence with Dr. Grimshaw and Reverend Aldrich, and a memoir he'd written late in life titled Bearing Witness, a child's account of slavery's moral destruction. It was published posthumously in 1899 and created a minor sensation in academic circles, though it was largely ignored by the general public who'd already moved on from Reconstruction-era debates. Dr. Grimshaw's sealed letter was opened after his death in 1873. It caused a brief stir among Charleston's Historical Society members who read it, but was ultimately dismissed as the confused recollections of an elderly man with failing faculties. The local newspaper ran a small item noting that certain unfounded allegations against a deceased member of Charleston society had been reviewed and found baseless. The letter was placed in the Historical Society's archives marked unsubstantiated claims, historical interest only. Reverend Aldrich's account, deposited with church archives with instructions to remain sealed for 50 years, was discovered in 1897 during renovations of the church basement. By then, Henrietta was 18 years dead, Charles had just committed suicide, and Thomas and William were elderly men far from South Carolina. The church council reviewed the document and decided after lengthy debate that publicizing decades-old allegations served no purpose except to harm the reputations of people no longer alive to defend themselves. The account was resealed with a notation that it should remain confidential indefinitely. It wasn't until 1952 that the full story finally emerged in a form that couldn't be dismissed or re-aired. The Grenville house had stood empty since Henrietta's death, slowly deteriorating through decades of neglect. Various families had attempted to purchase and restore it, but all abandoned the effort within months, citing unexplained difficulties, structural problems that shouldn't have existed, contractors who refused to continue work, a general atmosphere that made people uncomfortable. By 1952, the building was condemned and scheduled for demolition. The construction crew hired for the job began their work on a Tuesday morning in April, exactly 105 years after Diner's death, as they tore into